Welcome everyone to our Tech in 20 conference today. Today we're going to be talking about RESTful Web Services, and our speaker is Jeff Morris, or affectionately we call him JMO, and he's just outstanding at this kind of concept and this technical information and making this information understandable and easy to consume. And I hope that today as you go in and listen to this that you'll take some notes and ask some questions as we go along, or wait, we're actually going to do questions at the end. But fill in the polls, and as you can see, use pollev.com/tech20 or text your answers to 22333. And but we look forward to this and helping you understand a little bit more about this change in technology that's really revolutionized how applications talk to each other. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff.
All right. I guess I would say good morning, everyone. I think most of the people on this call probably, even though it's afternoon here in California where I'm from, I think many of you are in Asia Pac, or it's Tuesday morning. So good morning to you. And as Clayton said, we're going to talk today about RESTful Web Services. But I think to be able to understand what RESTful Web Services are, we really need to understand web services in general and really get to the heart of, what are we trying to achieve, where do these concepts come from? So to look at that, we really take a step back to understanding what technology was like in the 80s and 90s, pretty much in the early 90s. One of the biggest challenges that application teams, especially enterprises, were having was one of interoperability. How do we get systems to talk to each other? And back then, many applications were built in C or C++. Object-oriented paradigm was really kicking off in the 90s. And the biggest challenge, though, is that every operating system would have different versions of the compiler, and if I needed to communicate between systems, I'd have to worry about things like how is an integer represented on this platform versus another, is it 2 bytes or 4 bytes, et cetera, et cetera. And so from that, the big companies and vendors and standards organizations started developing ways for interoperability. And you might have heard the term CORBA, Common Object Request Broker Architecture, which was really a standard way for objects to talk to each other among systems. So then we fast forward to the end of the 90s where the internet started to explode and we started having web-based architectures. And Java came along right around the same time. In the early days of Java, we were still using CORBA for that. But out of that grew this paradigm of web services. How do we expose these services over the web to be addressed? And I noticed from the poll here that there's a pretty mixed group of understanding of this, so we're kind of going to go through a little bit of a review of that today. And I'm having trouble paging down to the next slide. There it is. Okay, so just to start off, what is a RESTful web service? If we look at the exact definition, you see it here on the slide. It's a RESTful web service is the custodian of a collection of resources on which a client can ask the canonical operations of HTTP via the canonical operations of HTTP. So the way I look at that, essentially RESTful web services provide access to server-side operations with an easy-to-use URL-based mechanism. I think if we understand it in that way, you get to the crux of what they're all about. But when we talk about, in general, what is a web service, and I talked a little bit about this in the opening, it is simply a mechanism for this interoperability, but over a network. When we add the network in, that's where the web started to explode, is that we're no longer only communicating between servers within our own data center. We may be going over a wide area network, or in this case, the internet. And some of the things that came across, XML-based was very important. XML really came on the scenes around the same time as a method, as a method of data interchange. Prior to XML, there was a variety of different, generally non-portable ways of exchanging data. So XML was revolutionary, and it just basically gave the world a way to speak and communicate data effectively. It's at the crux of web services. It's also loosely coupled architecture, meaning there's not a lot of dependency. It shouldn't be a lot of dependency between the two systems. We're supporting remote procedure calls. I mean, this kind of is a throwback to the concepts of CORBA, that we could just make a call. That client-server concept is still present in this design of web services, that I could just make a client call to this service, but using the web service. and it has a support document exchange. The main idea is that we'd send this data back and forth, but we will do it in the content of the document, and that goes, part and parcel to using XML as a way of changing data. We look at the information that we're interchanging in this document. So if we look at those traditional web services that came out of that initial architecture, generally they're what we call SOAP-based. And SOAP, another one of the many acronyms that are at play here, is Simple Object Access Protocol. Ironically, at the time, it was meant to be a much more simple way to communicate than with its predecessor, Corba. But if we look at it today, it's still a bit complex. It does require WSDL and a contract. WSDL is Web Services Definition Language, which is just another one of these standards that says if I'm going to advertise the availability of a web service, this is how I'm going to describe it. And so that's required with SOAP-based web services. We use a UDDI, which is essentially a directory where we can go locate services. So there's got to be some mechanism to find the services where they happen to exist in the enterprise. And the two main technologies you've seen as implementations of this have been JAX RPC and JAX WS. Those are the two basic Java-based standards that rolled up around this. But those are just standards that people agreed as to how to implement it on top of the architectural paradigm. And there have been many implementations. Access probably being one of the most popular in that it's open source and it's embraced by the open source community. And then WebSphere and WebLogic, the two largest application server vendors, have had their own sort of flavors and implementations of web services on top of their platforms. So that's where the world lived for quite a while until RESTful Web Services came along. If we fast forward then and we look at what is RESTful, REST in and of itself is something called representational state transfer, which was a specification that was made by a guy named Roy Fielding from here in California. It was part of his graduate dissertation at UC Irvine, and he defined REST. And essentially, what we're saying is he was specifying was a way to communicate over HTTP. The key thing about REST is that HTTP is URI, Uniform Resource based, and it uses a RESTful web service will use just standard HTTP methods of get, post, put, and delete for interaction to the web service, just like you would with a web browser. It's using a traditional, create, read, update, delete methodology that you can trace back to databases and computer system architecture going back for several decades. And along with this, then, came a new specification in the Java world called JAX RS, and you can see one implementation of that in Apache CXF, but there are others. Again, these things in REST in and of itself is just an architectural paradigm, and then RESTful Web Services is just a specification. JAX RS is a specification for how to go about doing this, because it is a paradigm shift for how things are done. And at the end of the day, if you look at this stool on the side here, it's really talking about the standard object-oriented paradigm of having nouns and verbs to move data around, and the output is coming in XML. We still keep XML as the main document, but the key difference there is there's no more SOAP required. And if I go to the next slide, then there's a comparison of what happens in SOAP-based web services versus RESTful web services. And if you look at the top in the SOAP-based, as I described before, they're more contract-based. The SOAP headers, and in every method that describe what's coming, it's based upon WSDL. WSDL must be present to advertise the web services. And one of the potential drawbacks is the complex client code required to access this. The reason people have moved forward to RESTful web services is that it can be all done through basic HTTP mechanisms. It's a stateless system. It's all resource located based. It's much easier generally to run the client. And I noticed you're all responding to the poll here. We threw this out here. We're not really knowing what the answer is to this question, but we threw a couple ideas out there. And if I had to pick between these four choices, I would probably agree with most of you out there that are saying it's Amazon. And why do I say that? If you think about what web services are doing most, they're most well suited for business-to-business type of e-commerce interchange. And there's not a more prevalent e-commerce platform out there now than Amazon. If you look back at how Amazon grew up, they started in the late 90s with this whole web architecture. And one of the biggest things they've achieved, I think, personally, is that they've achieved this e-commerce platform that many of the web vendors out there today rely upon. And so that's really where web services come in. They allow a lot of businesses to interchange, and it really embraces the core concept of code reuse and interoperability that's at the heart of this architecture. So I'm looking forward here to this last piece, kind of summarizing it up here. You know, RESTful Web Services are really becoming the standard. Most application development now, I mean, as you saw before, the specification was in 2000. It really started getting out into industry around 2006, 2007, 2008, and it's been in the last couple of years where we're really starting to see it be prevalent. And it's, you know, the paradigm shift has happened. Most new development is being done with this type of a paradigm for some of the reasons we described. But how does that affect us at CA? I think we simply need to be aware that our customers are using these and how to help them manage and deal with them. We look at some of the pros and cons, and I'm very interested to see what some of the answers to this, the poll are as they go forth here. And I see that it says flexibility question mark. Yeah, I would say flexibility from the standpoint that at the client, I think you're going to see the ability to consume web services will go up with this architecture, right? Many people can publish them, but one of the barriers in the past is even if I have a web services API, how do I access them? There's so many different ways, different types of clients. There's a little bit more of a tightly coupled binding than we would hope for than the original architects of web services had hoped for. So for most web services, I see that we can still access them now through, you could go into your browser and type in a URL and be accessing a RESTful web service. We use some of this in our technology here at CA now. We have our SOI solution, Catalyst uses it, our AppLogic product uses it. In fact, one of my interactions with it earlier, a little bit last year, was that we had to build a quick little EP agent to pull some of the performance metrics out of an AppLogic solution into our APM solution to publish that data. And because they were using RESTful web services, I was able to build that plugin in about 3 hours. Whereas, you know, if the traditional mechanism, it probably would have taken a little bit longer to work through some of the details. But it is, as somebody mentioned here, much easier to develop. It's not really, I mean, there is somewhat of a client. You do still need to be able to access a URL, but any client that can hit a URL. Yeah, I think NIMSOFT uses the RESTful web services. We have a lot of products at CA that have embraced this architecture. So let me see what else we have there. Yeah, somebody mentioned the simple EP agent to consume. That's kind of what I was referring to in the past, that we did that. I don't know if there are any other comments out there about why we think they're better or you know, pros and cons of RESTful over the traditional. I personally think that there's a lot of pros to these, but you know, that debate's still out there. If you really do need to have a more contract-based mechanism with your services, then you can, you know, then the prior sub-based ones will still be suitable for that. But I think that the majority of applications developed don't need that type of architecture, and it was really just a throwback to being a little too close to the previous version. Now we've gone one more iteration down the path, and you can always keep improving upon these architectures as, you know, as we go forward. I think I got through this a little bit faster. Are there any other questions we might have about that?
If you were to go and if you were to go and do this, does the company that you're trying to connect to that has the web services there, right? They have it in an API, right? And then, so do they essentially publish the list of the connections that they have, or how do you find them, I guess?
Well, it's a resource. So they'll give you a resource. It's basically URL based, so you would have to know it's a URL when they publish it. It's not as much as a WSDL, but even with a WSDL, you need to know the URL to get the WSDL. So it's a very similar thing, but it's using a resource-based paradigm, and it's hierarchical in nature, right? So you get it. It's like, you know, if you think of the way URLs are constructed, you know, you put the slashes between the components that really make up a tree structure for the way documents are organized on a website. So you think of these web services as just other components of the website using the same hierarchical structure. I mean, one of the quotes I saw, which is that I think is one of the best ones about RESTful Web Services, is that RESTful Web Services put the web back into web services. I mean, it really is embracing the rest of the core web technologies, whereas you could make the argument that earlier versions of web services didn't so much do that. They had XML, but this is really truly web-based from the standpoint that it's HTTP, HTML, URI, that architectural paradigm.
So do you see any downside to this?
Yeah, I haven't really found any yet. To me, I see it as an evolution. If you look at the history of computing, we're always making improvements, and so each major architectural shift was hopefully an improvement over the previous one. At least from this standpoint, I just see it as an evolution, right? And it, mostly pros, not a lot of cons from my point of view.
Ryan,
because it's all about consumption, right? You want the consumption to be as easy as possible. Going back to what I said at the very beginning, the entire problem we were trying to solve and have been trying to solve in computing for all these years is it's all about code reuse and interoperability. Java went a long way, I think, with the write once run anywhere concept of really getting people over that paradigm. And Web Services takes you one step further to just really be able to build these things as discrete components that perform a function that anyone can consume. And this just takes that concept of anyone can consume to the next level.
Ryan, can you check and see if there's any questions on the line, please?
At this time, if you wish to ask a question, please press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. Again, that's star 1 to ask a question. And we have no questions at this time.
Okay. Well, I've got another one for you, Jeff, and that would be, so when we do this, I mean, are you stuck with Java going through this, or can I, if I am, using a different application program, or a code, different kind of code, can I do that too and interop with that, or do I have to all stay with Java kind of a thing?
And I assume you're talking in that case as a client that I want to consume. You want to consume a web service that somebody else has published.
Right, right.
No, that's the beauty of it. It's completely stateless and it's completely web technology. The server doesn't care what the client's doing as long as it can speak HTTP, right? So you could write like I said, you can open up an Internet Explorer browser and point it to a RESTful web service, and the XML document will show up in your browser. Right. Generally, if you want to do something more interesting with it, you'll write some client code to retrieve that XML and do something with it. But if I just want to get an answer, you can do that. You can just put it in the browser. So there's no restriction whatsoever on the client code. So it's one step better from that standpoint. And one of the questions that came up this morning, which was really good, was what happens on the server side? How do companies migrate? From maybe they're using some SOAP-based into to REST-based. And, on the server side, again, this whole thing is just an architecture and a paradigm. You still do have to implement the standards, and that's where I mentioned that the JAX-RS comes from. It's a standard that the Java community has adopted for, just how to do the server-side components of these things. And there, again, will be multiple implementations of that. Apache Access, is kind of on the forefront of this. They haven't, as I mentioned before, the CXF platform has RESTful Web Services. And even the standard Access 2 platform has a mechanism by which the traditional SOAP-based web services that are there with an update can, if they don't see a SOAP request, then they'll automatically default to REST Web Services. So you can have the same web service support either a SOAP or a non-SOAP client.
Yeah. So, Jeff, I got a couple of questions that came in on the chat line. Are there any CA products that we service? Do they return JSON documents?
I can't say for sure on that. I don't know. I mean, JSON is one of the technologies. JSON is part of what you can use to pass data back and forth with REST. JSON is supported as part of it, but I don't know if we're using JSON with ours or not. We probably are, but I can't say. Generally, the standard is XML, but JSON, especially from the request side, JSON is supported as part of HTTP.
Okay, and then the other one that I got was from, and it was regarding security and this, and do we have the ability to go in and have a well-defined ability to say for example, that customer A can only pull data ABC, but customer B can pull A, C, D, X. You know, is there that kind of level of security associated with this, or how do we implement security on top of that?
Right, so security itself, I mean, isn't part of the specification for what RESTful is at its core. But you've been able to secure web services the way you've been able to secure them. It has to do with the way the implementations are on the server side. And as you secure any other web resource, you can secure a web service, because you're essentially trying to, you essentially have to authenticate to the server, you know, in general. And so how granular you make that authentication is really based upon the security platform you put in front, and it's usually a separate component, something like SiteMinder, for example. You know, that's what SiteMinder and some of our security suite is meant to do. It's meant to help companies add a security thing on top of that. But it's generally viewed from an application architecture perspective as a separate component. And switching from SOAP-based to REST-based doesn't make a big dent in that, I don't believe. Now, I have to admit, I haven't really gone into the nitty-gritty of looking at that from the server side, as far as what changes in the actual implementation of the services, but architecturally, I wouldn't expect it to be that much different.
Okay. Ryan, are there any other calls out on the line?
Yes, we do have a question from the line of Nat Srinivasan.
Okay. Hi, Nat.
Hi, Clayton. How are you? Hi, Jeff. Great topic. Excellent presentation. Thank you. I have partly a comment, partly a question. You know, I work in the advanced authentication product line, and a couple of customers asked me or asked us, you know, if we had RESTful Web Services front end to our servers. We are still working on that, so I'm curious, you know, if we have had similar feedback on our other products from our customers, and you know, to what degree we have heard that kind of feedback.
Are they asking for it? Is that what you're saying? Are you asking if they are asking for it? Is that what you're asking?
That's right.
That's what I heard. Yeah, that's what I heard. So, and I think, you know, that me personally, I haven't seen a couple, and in fact, SOI, a product I've been spending a lot of time with recently, the next major version that releases is going to include a RESTful Web Service API to access all of the metrics that it provides currently, you know, there's a SOAP-based web service API that comes with the current version, and they're migrating it to REST-based. So I definitely think you're going to see more and more customers beginning to expect it. I mean, as an architectural paradigm, it is out there now. I mean, it has taken hold in the industry. If you look and do some research, you'll see that most apps are being built with that in mind. So we should be, you know, our application development teams should be migrating to it. I would think, you know, to serve our customers better.
Yep.
So you know, the types of products that we build, we always have customers wanting access to the data. And so what I think, you know, when we look at it from the SOI perspective architecturally, it basically, they even advertise it as the headless API. You can do a lot with it the more you expose. And if you make it easy, you know, if you make it easier for the customers to consume it, I see it as a way that, one of the biggest things that, you know, in enterprise software, we're trying to serve so many masters. And we build these big, extremely complex applications to solve a problem. But if you go from one customer to the next, the biggest complaints or anything you'll see is about how the presentation is, because that's where people get very personal. No matter what data we're sending, one guy is going to want it looking a certain way in his environment. And I think that RESTful Web Services, if we expose some of those things, will allow customers to add their own front ends on top of these things, and then it will solve that problem for us, so we don't have to feel like we're tied down to one GUI or the other. I think that's sort of the evolution I've seen in some of the, you know, the architectures. You look at web architecture started out as a concept of n-tiered architecture, and it was meant to be a separation of the client from the server, and this is sort of, you know, the next step in making that reality.
Any other call or any other questions, Ryan?
At this time, we have no further questions.
All right. So if you'll take just a moment and rate this presentation, we appreciate it. We appreciate you being here and the opportunity that we have to share this with you. I think it's really good. And Jeff, definitely appreciate you taking the time and making this what for me at least, and I think for a lot of other people, was a very confusing and very non-understood kind of a thing, making it really so that we can understand what we're talking about and feel comfortable with talking to our customers. I really appreciate it, and a really good job. And so next week, we're going to be doing big data. In fact, Nat, who is just on the phone with a question, is going to be doing big data for us. And looking forward to that and understanding what big data is. I mean, it's talked about everywhere. And so come join us next week on February 11th, and we'll look forward to talking about big data then. And until then, good selling.